price to come? Is the same price? Promise? I promise? Same price? And I will join you here. Todo mundo aqui na fila do gargarejo. Aqui, ó. Okay, good morning. My name is Paulo Sotero. I am the director of the Brazil Institute at the Wilson Center. It's a great pleasure to welcome back to the Wilson Center this morning Ambassador Liliana Ayalde for what I understand is her last public event as U.S. Ambassador to Brazil. We planned this a few weeks ago. Ambassador Sergio Amaral was scheduled to be here, but he was called to stay in Brasilia, where he is today, for consultations with the foreign minister, with the president. Therefore, we have here Ambassador Ayalde, but that was the original idea. To give Ambassador Ayalde, who has been here for 3 or 4 times that I remember, a chance to share with us her thoughts about Brazil-U.S. relations in recent past, directions for the future. Regardless of what is happening in both capitals, the fact that there is, I believe, a roadmap to the relationship, Brazil and the United States remain the 2 largest economies and the 2 largest democracies in this hemisphere, and that reality is an important consideration. Liliana Ayalde has served the United States as ambassador to Brazil, before that as ambassador to Asunción, to Paraguay, also as Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Western Hemisphere, with responsibilities for overseeing U.S. bilateral relationships with Central America, Caribbean, and Cuba. That happens to be back in the news due to the passing of Fidel Castro. She joined the civil service in 1982 and started her international career in Dhaka, in Bangladesh. She's a member of the senior foreign service with the rank of career minister, having been posted to Guatemala, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Colombia, and obviously Washington, D.C. with AID. Ambassador Ayalde is from Maryland, has a bachelor's degree from the School of International Studies at American University and a master's in public health from Tulane University. She is the recipient of numerous awards and honors, and it is a great pleasure. Actually, Ambassador Ayalde also has other American diplomats. This is something that I have been around here for more than 35 years, and sometimes you know of situations where you have to ask people in public service to do special favors for humanitarian and other reasons. And I had recently to ask Ambassador Ayalde for such a favor, as I had to Ambassador Sobo and to others. And I take this opportunity to recognize that diplomats, I think from both countries, from time to time, go out of their ways to help people in distressful situations. And I am a witness of that kind of generosity. After Ambassador Ayalde speaks, we will have a group here of friends, Juliano Basile from Valor Econômico, Kelly Mayman from managing partner from McClarty Associates, Matthew Taylor, associate professor at American University, and Joel Velasco, senior vice president for Albright Stonebridge, to talk a little bit about the future or the outlook for the relationship from both perspectives of journalists, students of Brazil-U.S., Brazil and Brazil-U.S. relations, and businesses. With that, I would like to invite Ambassador Ayalde to take the floor.
Thank you, Paulo, and thank you very much to the Wilson Center for allowing me this opportunity on the heels after the Thanksgiving weekend, which I know people are still kind of making their way back to work. But I felt it was useful to have a time to reflect on my 3+ years in Brazil. I doubt that any other ambassador had the privilege of experiencing the many ups and downs in times in Brazil. I was there for electoral campaigns, presidential elections, municipal elections, the turbulent political times, and impeachment, and certainly the economic downturn, Lava Jato, and it just goes on, plus the mega events of the World Cup and the Olympics. All that pulled together into 3 years plus. And so I felt it, reflecting on that time and sharing some of those thoughts with you would be of interest, particularly as we phase our own transition here and the uncertainties that usually come with any transition. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts with you. I'm going to go ahead and I've prepared some remarks so that I don't stray away into tangents. I'm going to keep to it, even though it's a small audience. And then I really do welcome the questions and comments, because that's where I can probably elaborate a little bit more. I think it's important to highlight that the United States and Brazil have always been friends. From the moment when we first, we were the first country to recognize Brazil's independence in 1822 until today, our friendship has weathered the test of time and survived any number of ideological and political changes in both countries. It is a friendship born of shared values and common beliefs, and this partnership between the two largest democracies and economies of the Americas has helped underpin the peace and stability of the hemisphere for the better part of 2 centuries. That does not mean that we have always seen eye to eye, or that we haven't had our legitimate policy differences over the years. Even the best of friends have arguments and disagreements. The degree of partnership and cooperation has obviously varied as well. But at a very basic level, down to the individual Brazilian and the individual American on the street, there's a mutual admiration and respect that serves as the constant backdrop to our political and commercial relationship. In addition to that admittedly amorphous concept of friendship, there's a very pragmatic and objective economic underpinning to our relationship. We're the 2 largest economies in the hemisphere, and our trade in goods and services is around $100 billion a year, supporting hundreds of thousands of jobs in both countries. We see opportunity for this number to grow significantly in the future. Partnerships between our companies, whether of the headline-grabbing variety like Embraer and Boeing cooperation, or at a smaller but still vital level between small and medium enterprises, help to drive innovation and deepen the linkages between our economies. The United States is the biggest market for Brazil's manufactured goods, and the United States is still the largest source of foreign direct investment in Brazil at over $112 billion, while Brazilian investment in the United States tops $22 billion, doubling in recent years, showing that we continue to bet on the success of each other's economic future. That mutual economic interdependence, which has both long-standing and long-growing, further solidifies the friendship between our two countries. I arrived in Brazil almost 3.5 years ago at what arguably was one of the most sensitive and tense moments in our relationship, following the heels of the Snowden disclosures. I don't want to dwell on the subject, but suffice it to say that relations were strained. However, I believed then, and still believe now, that this state of affairs would not last, and that our relationship was strong enough that it would recover and endure. Slowly, gradually, that belief was borne out as we worked hard to repair our ties and move forward, leading to an eventual visit of then President Dilma Rousseff to Washington in June of last year. In a very tangible way, that visit reset and re-energized the relationship, and the degree of the partnership since then has been impressive in scope and in depth. On the trade and investment side, we launched mechanisms to help facilitate bilateral trade flows, to look at regulatory coherence and standards to eliminate obstacles to growth, and to improve patent registration. We also agreed to work together on environmental issues and climate change, an indispensable cooperation given our respective geographic size and economic importance, and one that paid off in the final ratification of the Paris Climate Change Agreement recently concluded in Morocco. The United States and Brazil were joint leaders in Paris, and our leadership will help protect the environment for generations to come. On the security side, we signed a defense cooperation agreement and a general security of military information agreement, both of which permit a greater flow of information, goods, services, and technologies to advance the security in both countries. We also launched the discussions that eventually led to the inaugural Brazil-U.S. Defense Industry Dialogue this September, a very productive forum to identify opportunities and challenges in the defense industry and enhance our bilateral cooperation. In addition, we created very productive working groups to discuss internet governance and human rights issues. Given where the relationship had been just 2 years before, the scope of the agenda and the results coming out of the visit were almost unimaginable. We had a very successful collaboration with Brazil in support of the Olympic security efforts, and we congratulate our Brazilian friends on the resounding success of that mega event. We are very hopeful that the cooperation and the ties created between our law enforcement agencies during the Games will serve as the basis for ongoing cooperation and partnership on various security issues. Since June 2015, we also maintained the momentum on a number of fronts in our bilateral relationship, despite the political transition. For example, we recently finalized an agreement to permit reciprocal imports of beef, which will create new opportunities for both countries in terms of access to each other's markets and to third countries as well. The Open Skies Agreement, which continues to make its way through Brazilian Congress, will, when finalized hopefully before the end of the year, literally create new linkages and connections between our two countries. We also continue to partner on the multilateral level, whether through the UN, the OAS, or other international bodies. Based on our shared values, we continue to push for issues such as the defense of human rights and promotion of democratic participation within the region and globally. Through trilateral cooperation, we had very successful joint development projects in Latin America, Caribbean, and Africa, such as programs to promote food security and address HIV/AIDS issues. Brazil's leading role in the peacekeeping operation in Haiti has been essential to the gradual progress being made there, and its support of other peacekeeping initiatives across the globe demonstrates its importance as a global player. Working together, we secured an ambitious amendment to the Montreal Protocol to phase down the production and use of potent greenhouse gases and the adoption of an agreement to set international aviation and the path towards sustainable carbon-neutral growth. Health issues has also been front and center in our engagement over the past year as we ramp up our already strong partnership in order to combat the Zika virus epidemic in the region. Through public health collaboration, joint research in vaccines and new diagnostics, and the private sector engagement targeted towards strengthening health data systems, our two countries are demonstrating the ways we can work together to tackle these kinds of public health challenges that improve health for people in both our countries and throughout Latin America. Through a working group on human rights created in July 2015, our governments have continued to cooperate on a range of social inclusion and human rights priorities at the UN Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly to ensure that human rights are protected regardless of a person's race, religion, sexual orientation, or gender identity. We have also addressed worrisome human rights situations in places like Syria and North Korea, and highlighted the importance of spaces for a vibrant civil society. Such fruitful cooperation in multilateral fora complements standing bilateral agreements on the advancement of women and girls and the initiatives to eliminate ethnic and racial discrimination. So it has been a very exciting time in terms of our partnership and the potential to grow our cooperation. I would be remiss, however, if I failed to put this into the context of the developments within Brazil, which have obviously gone through a period of intense political change and is still experiencing difficult economic times. Those factors have undoubtedly affected the resources available to Brazil, both politically and financially, and at times injected distractions which we had to accommodate to. In some ways, that makes the progress we have made still more impressive. Even as Brazil went through an impeachment process, while demanding an enormous and unnecessary concentration of attention and effort in the Olympics, even with the troubled economic picture, we did not lose a step in terms of our work to strengthen the bilateral relationship. Just to give you one example, the defense industry dialogue is a concept that we conceived under one Minister of Defense, in large part designed under a second, and then implemented under a third, yet each approached it with enthusiasm and commitment. That led to a very successful engagement that generated real action and items for follow-up. Rather than just accepting remarkable degree of commitment as a given, I think it's worth asking, how did that happen? With everything else that was going on, how did we manage to keep moving forward on so many fronts? And I think the answer to that question goes back to the fundamental level of shared interests and values that underlies our friendship. Brazil and the United States are too important to each other to let our relationship lie dormant, regardless of what else is happening domestically. We have seen that time and time again over the years, our engagement and our friendship continues to prosper regardless of outside events. I'd like to discuss an issue that has been, of course, on the forefront of all our minds, especially here in Washington, and that is the change of administration here and how that will affect U.S. Brazil relationships. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Policies, of course, will change from administration to administration. With regard to Brazil, however, the underlying interest in partnering with Brazil will remain regardless of administration, just as we will continue to hold the shared values that unite us and that drive our cooperation. I saw firsthand how our relationship maintained momentum through the political transition in Brazil, and I believe that our strong engagement will continue under our new president-elect. Will there be some adjustments of emphasis on individual initiatives or new programs created to reflect our new president's different approach? Undoubtedly. But I do not believe that these will markedly change the positive direction of our overall engagement. Over the past 3 years plus, I have witnessed that our commitment to Brazil is not a transitory political whim. It is a core interest and principle of U.S. foreign policy. Based on this premise today, I'd like to share with you some thoughts about the bilateral relationship and where I think it should be going in the future. First, I believe that we must continue to look for ways to deepen our economic ties. Increased trade and investment will bring benefits to both countries. We know from talking to Brazilian leaders that they want to reduce the custo Brazil and make the country more competitive. But saying it and doing it are different things, and we need the help of the private sector to really make inroads in this regard. We will continue to count on the private sector to share their challenges encountered when doing business in Brazil, bringing these issues to us as openings for engagement between our two governments. We want to continue to identify opportunities for partnership or innovation that are not being taken advantage of, and be involved in the possible solutions to facilitate or support those initiatives. Work with both governments to help us be proactive supporters of economic cooperation than just being reactive resolvers of problems. Second, I see great potential for further partnership in security issues. Transnational crime undermines the sovereignty and order of all nation-states. As we saw in numerous unfortunate attacks over the past year across the globe, whether in Paris, India, Orlando, or Ethiopia, terrorists make no distinction about the nationality of their victims. The potential proliferation of weapons of mass destruction represents an existential threat to all humanity. And leaving aside the threats that are out there, a strong, secure Brazil is a stronger partner for the United States in promoting peace in the region and globally. We do not always agree on the best technical approach in security matters, but our core belief aligns closely, and those shared beliefs can and should serve as the basis for ever-growing cooperation. This can take the shape of information sharing, commercial partnerships, joint innovation, or other forms of cooperation. Some of those activities we could undertake today. Others will require intergovernmental agreements. But these are challenges that are too serious and too relevant for both countries to let them sit on the table without action, and we need to put forth the effort to move them forward. Third, we must continue to work together globally to achieve progress on shared commitment to the protection of human rights and the advancement of democratic values. And finally, I think we need to continue to push for the people-to-people exchanges and interactions, whether in the context of formal educational exchange programs or just tourist-level travel. I believe that the greater the degree of interaction between Brazilians and Americans on a personal level, the stronger our relationship will be. As I said toward the beginning of my remarks, Brazilian and Americans in general just instinctively like each other. At the heart of the matter, our respective citizens want to live in the same kind of world. That is a powerful unifying force. Providing larger numbers of people in both countries the opportunity to meet and learn more about the other can therefore only help to enhance our long-term political friendship. So we must look for ways to encourage greater numbers of students, tourists, business visits, and so forth, whether through formal exchanges, programs, or through mechanisms to facilitate legitimate travel in both directions. So in short, my message is that the state of our bilateral relationship is strong and moving in the positive direction. There will be inevitably bumps along the way or areas where we disagree, but those issues will arise on the margins. When it comes to our core values and interests, there is far more that unites Brazil and the United States than divides us, and the friendship that began almost 200 years ago will continue to characterize our relationship, contributing to the ongoing prosperity and security of both countries that we share in this hemisphere. Thank you very much, and I will entertain questions when the time's right.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Ayalde. I like to note one thing that we learned recently, and I learned this morning, that actually Ambassador Ayalde's successor in Brasilia, that has been already appointed and confirmed by the U.S. Senate, will be in place in Brasilia before the inauguration of President Trump. So in terms of the functional continuation of the relationship, it's set. There will be a continuous channel of dialogue there in here. So it's an important, I think, consideration too. With that, I would like to invite questions, and I would like to ask first if Cindy Arnson, who is the director of the Latin American program here at the Wilson Center, who hosted Liliana Ayalde here in that capacity, would ask or make a comment or ask a question on behalf of our colleagues here at the Wilson Center.
Wonderful. Paulo, thank you very much. I have a lot of questions, Ambassador Ayalde, and thank you again for that very lucid and comprehensive presentation. One is a question about Brazil's relationship within Latin America. How does the current administration in Brazil see its relationships changing, given the election in Argentina and the election in Peru and the talk of greater dialogue between the Pacific Alliance and Mercosur? How do you perceive Brazil's role in South America in general? And a second question has to do with U.S. Brazil relations. During the George W. Bush administration, obviously there was a PT government, in Brazil during most of that time. There was a growing and I think pronounced distance between Latin America and the United States, with some bilateral exceptions, Colombia being, I think, the most notable one. Given the perception and the rejection of policies of unilateralism and the intervention in Iraq and other kinds of things, given what seem to be statements by the new administration vis-a-vis rolling back the executive orders on Cuba, do you foresee a greater distancing between the United States and the rest of the region, given what we know, the little that we know really about the president-elect's statements and the statements of people that are close to him?
Ambassador, let me add to that question one aspect that Cindy did not mention, and I know that there have been part of consultations and conversations between Brazilian and American officials, and has to do what is happening in Venezuela. There are all indications that we are witnessing the collapse of a regime that has repercussions for especially the neighboring countries, and especially two of them, Colombia and Brazil. People amassing at borders of those countries, and I wanted to ask you, from your conversations in Brazil, and I know that the United States has been urging Brazil to somehow get involved, because it will be more Brazil's problem than actually the U.S. problem when the regime falls apart. What can you share with us about that?
So let me start with the question about the relationship of Brazil within the Latin American region. Obviously, it's a policy question posed more appropriately to the government authorities that we do have here, the chargé, but I'll give you my perspective of what I see, and it's certainly changed as the region changed, and there was the impeachment, and of course President Temer administration came in. There was a very clear signal, a different signal in terms of engagement, taking ideology out of the interactions, and that's been very clear in the immediate engagement with Argentina and engagement with Mercosur, prioritizing the practical aspect of the relationship, the economic and commercial objectives of Mercosur, sort of getting it back to basics. So that has been very clear, and the relationship with Argentina seems to be going very strong and very, very well in the right direction. And then with others, a re-engagement, for instance, I think there had been a distance with Colombia, with Mexico, and those engagements are strong. And again, I think because the ideology was taken out of the engagements, and the situation in the region was changing with the elections and the results of the elections, you hardly, the UNASUR's sort of more leftist type of agenda was morphing, has been morphing, has been taken out. And so those regional entities will likely take a different form. And that's why I see, for instance, what will happen to UNASUR and the leadership there. I'm sure the country's foreign ministers are talking about that, and what happens in January when Samper moves out, and who comes in. And I think what I'm hearing and picking up is they would like to have somebody that's less ideological than in the past, and to make that entity more useful in regional agendas in a different way that was in the past. So I think that is a very welcomed kind of debate and a process that is that I perceive. And so the relationship is changing as the ideology has been taken out of those debates. And it's easier for us then, okay, because then we don't become the target and the excuse for everything else, but people are looking at really competitiveness issues and how to facilitate trade within the region and other issues, whether it's the peace process in Colombia, and the situation in Venezuela. On Venezuela, this is an issue that for the past 3 years, I have raised it with everyone in government. And I must admit that initially, under the previous administration, there was a reluctance in recognizing that there was an issue. And even when I said, okay, well, let's say politically we don't talk, let's put politics aside, let's talk about the economy. Even then, it was until things really started breaking down. With this administration, there's a recognition that, yes, like you say, there's already a growing number of Venezuelans coming in to the northern border, and these are very small towns in that part of the country, and services are being stretched. There are people living in the streets. It's obviously a repercussion that's already being felt by Brazil through those migrants, which can grow as the humanitarian crisis within Venezuela gets worse. Our conversations on Venezuela with Brazilian government has been very, very productive. The question is, what do we do? I think we're all sort of at a loss at, how do we avoid a further worsening of the humanitarian crisis. I know Brazil has offered Venezuela medication, and the Venezuelan government has refused to take it because they want to take it, as opposed to it being delivered through an NGO or an international organization or even the church. They want to be able to deliver it. And so the Brazilian government has been very clear that they want to make sure that those resources, those medications get to the people that need and are not used for political manipulation. It is a topic that we are, whenever we can, we talk about and see how we can look at solutions, and we still, I think we are much more joined and have similar messages. We're very grateful to the Brazilian government for having made very clear statements about human rights violations, the need for for engaging the opposition and the referendum and so forth. But it's like you say, it's not. It's collapsing, and we ourselves, and I know that Ambassador Shannon has been very engaged. I know Ambassador Shannon is considering a visit to Brazil, and of which Venezuela will certainly be a topic. It's not an easy answer. I don't think any of us have an answer, but we're certainly very engaged with Brazil on trying to look for possible solutions. In terms of the broader question of the region and the new policies, I think at this point it's all speculation. We don't have the details of what those changes may be in terms of policy. I can tell you one thing, in talking to Lula, he used to say that he was friends with President Bush, and they had very deep conversations, and they sort of respected each other. What the incoming administration will do to the region, I think we're all speculating. I really don't know. I think getting back to Brazil, things happen because there's so much engagement already. And you can't turn that off. I mean, I learned that lesson with the Snowden chapter, that people like each other and they will continue to come to study here if the economy continues to improve. We've seen an uptick, for instance, in visas. The tourist, even despite the economy not coming up as fast as and improving as fast as we would have wanted to, there is an uptick in the visa requests because people like to come to the United States to do business, to study, to visit. We have a very positive favorability rate right now towards the United States and Brazil. I think it's like 78%, which is very high. And so, I think that will carry the water, and we'll have to see what policy will dictate.
Thank you. Juliano, I think you had a question. Juliano Basile from Valor Econômico.
Thank you, Paulo. Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador, do you have any expectations that Brazil and the U.S. Can go beyond trade facilitation measures under the new administration, the Trump administration?
Well, I think if we're talking in agreements, probably not. But I think we can do a lot to on areas that will make Brazil more competitive, have more of interest to U.S. business. And some of the legislation that is being talked about, whether it's on the oil and gas sector, is very encouraging and very attractive. Local content, for instance. And I think all those are efforts that will attract more business. We have great opportunities in infrastructure, so that will happen regardless of an agreement. If we start talking of agreements, I think that's probably not going to fly. That's just my insight.
Yes. Could you identify yourselves, please? Wait for the mic.
Hi, my name is Isabel Alvarenga. I'm a reporter with the Medill News Service. With President-elect Trump's position on, the Paris Climate Agreement, what do you see for the future of U.S. Brazil relations, specifically in relation to climate change?
Well, like trade, that has been sort of the topic, the headline, and I think we need to see what it is at the other levels to see what it implies now, because now it's the implementation of those agreements, and so. How limiting, we will continue to work on it until we're told otherwise, and so we'll have to see. I would imagine that this is something that we won't see the effects of it for a little while, but for the time being, we have nothing but the agreement, so.
Margaret Deli Hayes.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. My question goes to the changes that you described in the defense cooperation dialogue. I had the privilege, I guess, of working on the Defense Institution Reform Initiative in what I think was the first chapter of an effort to establish a dialogue between the U.S. Defense Ministry and the Brazilian Defense Ministry. And in the discussions there, this is an agreement had been signed by both countries. Supposedly both were in agreement, but one perceived a real reluctance on the part of the Brazilian ministry to open up at all to the United States. And that really was on the part of the military, the joint staff, as opposed to the civilian side. But the civilian side was so relatively weak that nothing advanced. And so my question goes to what changed that allowed this evolution that you described between conception, advancement, and then finally implementation, and what did we end up with?
Definitely a change. To tell you that at the defense dialogue, we had different ministers represented and all saying the same thing. So there was consistency, and that had not been the case before. From the higher command in the military to different ministries, whether it was commerce, foreign ministry, as well as defense. The Minister of Defense invited me to a press conference, and I would recommend that you look at that. Again, these are statements. It's the beginning of a very different message of engagement beyond anything that we had heard before, and we had people there that had seen the past. So we were very encouraged. The other thing is this was embraced by both private sectors and the public sector. What led to that? I think taking the ideology out of it probably had something to do with it, encouraging it, and the sense that Brazil was being left behind, and that there were opportunities for great joint projects in defense. Ironically, at the time where we can do things together, there's no money, right? But as you well know, in the defense sector, you have to do the framework. You have to pull together a lot of these agreements to make sure things happen. So we're actually taking advantage of the time because it's ripe and both sides want it to really engage. And so I'd recommend that you look at that as it goes, because there's really a different tone. What led to it? I think, certainly the Temer administration has been very eager to get this going, and maybe, the chargé has a little bit more insights on this, but there's definitely been it's a different rhythm, a different interest, and this is the flavor of the day in a way. It's the defense industry dialogue has really taken a life of its own.
Thank you. Benoni Belli, Chargé d'Affaires from Brazil.
Thank you, Ambassador Ayalde, for your thoughtful presentation and for being such a committed champion of Brazil-U.S. relations. I would like to take advantage of your experience in Brazil for over 2.5 years and ask a very simple question for you. With the benefit of hindsight, what were the main missed opportunities in your opinion in Brazil-U.S. relations during these 3.5 years, and what should we do together to avoid missing the same opportunities in the future?
Well, I do think the Snowden chapter delayed our engagement. So time is precious. At a time with President Obama was very interested in engaging. The vice president was very strong friend of Brazil. A lot of patience, and admirably so, that, we waited. We had to wait. We could do things, but at a technical level, we couldn't do things at the policy level. So we lost opportunities to really engage at a time where we could have engaged even more in a much more forceful way. Because the politics there, it just didn't allow for it, elections, and therefore everything was put sort of at that level, put on hold, whereas we could work at the technical level, which really sustained it. And this is why I think no matter what, we're going to continue to work, because we work well together. Not always agree, but we work well together because we can discuss things together. But we lost the opportunities to really engage in a much more forceful way. times are different now. So now we have the other set of things. We have a new administration here with lots of questions, and so we're going to have to wait until that all settles down. The good thing is we have a framework, and we have a very clear set of joint priorities. You know, whether it's innovation and technology, whether it's in defense, whether it's on commercial issues. There is no arguing, and that is the easy areas to really do more of and be much more ambitious. Maybe what we've done is done things that we can do easier because of the politics at the time. We couldn't be too more ambitious, and so I think we're now walking up that and being much more so, and I think we can do much more. That's certainly the case.
Yeah, I would like to, any more? I'd like to ask one final question, and based on what you just said of Benoni's question, and something that was said here, this room, by Ambassador Shannon in December 2013, after the Snowden episode, which is that Brazilian and American diplomats and officials would have to learn to work in a different sort of world where both societies would demand from them results in a relationship. That the demand coming from society and no longer from the calculations of foreign policy experts. And I found that very interesting, and what you just said, it came also, I started hearing at that time, it is much more a dialogue, opening channels of dialogue between the two societies that is happening in education, in science, in technology, in businesses all the time. I was just at a meeting, we participated via Skype, a meeting at the Brazilian-American Chamber of Commerce in São Paulo last week, where there are people from JBS, from Stefanini, from Embraer, from the Brazilian companies that have moved to the United States, have established roots here, and employ tens of thousands of people in the United States. JBS employs 70,000 people.
Right.
Stefanini, I think, 2,000. Gerdau now produces steel in 19 U.S. states. Embraer obviously employs, I think, at least 1,000 people in Florida. So it is, have you sensed in your dealings with the impact of this aspect of the relationship, or do you think that Brazilians and American diplomats and officials feel this sort of pressure to do something
I'm
differently?
convinced that is the strength of our relationship. It's the people to people, whether it's in business, in the academia. It's just, I think there's just not that much knowledge of it or appreciation of it. It happens, but there could be more of, and it will grow. I mean, the Science Without Borders program, where we had 13,000 in a year, 13,000 students across universities, and speaking to those deans, they loved the Brazilian students because Brazilian students interacted with the rest of the student body. They talked about Brazil. There were diplomats in a way, and that's happening. But I think there's not a recognition of how broad. The link of Brazilians. I had this experience. I was invited not too long ago to speak about the diaspora, and I realized, what are they asking me? There's really no concept. It's a different concept of Brazilians because they're in business, they're in the schools. It's not the traditional diaspora like we think of in Salvador, So it dawned on me how much education we need to do because it's happening. It's happening in, like you say, in Gerdau and other big business. And that's the natural thing. And today's world is different. It works on, the youth is very powerful. social media is very powerful in Brazil. All the social media companies that we have there, Brazil's their second client in the world. And so the potential for using social media is amazing in getting the two countries closer together.
Well, on that hopeful note, I would like to thank you very much, Liliana, for your presentation and for being a friend of ours here at the Brazil Institute. Will remain open to you, whatever you do next, and please always think about us and come back.
Thank
A
you.
round of applause to Ambassador Liliana Ayalde. We will make a very short break and come back and resume with Kelly and Juliano and Matthew. And where is Joel? Goiano atrasado.